October 17, 1962, Washington, D.C. Frank Keller straightened his gray wool tie and smoothed the lapels of his navy suit as he walked up the granite steps of the State Department. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves from across the Potomac. His polished Oxfords clicked against the marble floor of the grand lobby as he flashed his identification badge to the security guard. "Morning, Mr. Keller," the guard said with a nod. "Morning, Walter." Frank returned the greeting with practiced ease, the same routine he'd followed for 11 years as a Foreign Service officer specializing in Soviet affairs. In his office on the third floor, Frank hung his coat on the wooden rack and settled at his desk. Classified cables from Moscow awaited his analysis. As the department's expert on Soviet economic policies, he had access to sensitive information about America's strategic planning regarding the USSR. Through his window, he could see the Washington Monument piercing the blue sky, a daily reminder of the democracy he'd sworn to serve. Or so everyone believed. The truth was more complicated. In moments of quiet reflection, Frank sometimes tried to pinpoint when his path had diverged, when Friedrich Konev had become Frank Keller. Was it during those hungry years in post-war Vienna where he'd been born to Russian parents? Or during his scholarship years at Columbia University, where his language skills had made him valuable to both superpowers? Or perhaps it was the moment in 1951 when a Soviet diplomat had shown him photographs of his aging parents in Moscow, their faces gaunt, their future dependent entirely on their son's cooperation. Frank opened his secure filing cabinet and began reviewing documents about American grain shipments to Eastern Europe. With practiced efficiency, he noted which details would interest his handlers, mentally encoding the information he would pass along during his next dead drop. The office telephone rang. "Keller speaking. Frank, it's James from the director's office. We need you in the conference room. The situation in Cuba is escalating." Frank's pulse quickened. "I'll be right there." He gathered his notepad and pen, mentally preparing to absorb whatever intelligence would be shared. As he walked down the hallway, he passed a bulletin board covered with employee announcements and a flyer for the department's Halloween party. Such ordinary moments of American life still felt like a performance to him, even after all these years. In the wood-paneled conference room, senior officials from state and the Pentagon were gathered around a table covered with maps and surveillance photographs. Tension filled the air like static electricity. "Gentlemen," said Assistant Secretary Townsend, "the President has been briefed on the U-2 reconnaissance findings. We have conclusive evidence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile installations in Cuba. This changes everything." Frank maintained his neutral expression while his mind raced. His KGB handlers hadn't informed him of missile deployments in Cuba, which meant either they didn't trust him with this information, or something had gone terribly wrong in the coordination between Soviet military and intelligence services. For the next 3 hours, he participated in discussions about potential diplomatic and military responses. His colleagues valued his insights into Soviet psychology and decision-making. Frank offered measured analysis while mentally cataloging every detail that would be useful to Moscow. "The Soviets are testing our resolve," he said when asked for his assessment. "But Khrushchev is a rational actor. He won't want this to escalate to nuclear exchange any more than we do." When the meeting adjourned, Frank returned to his office and closed the door. His scheduled dead drop wasn't for another week, but this information couldn't wait. He would need to signal his handler for an emergency meeting, a risk he'd taken only twice before in 11 years. That evening, Frank took the bus home to his modest row house in Georgetown. His neighbor, Mrs. Pembroke, was watering her mums as he walked up the sidewalk. "Terrible business, this Cuba situation," she said. "Howard says we should be stocking the basement with canned goods. What do you think, Frank?" "I'm sure cooler heads will prevail," he replied with a reassuring smile. "Have a pleasant evening, Mrs. Pembroke." Inside his home, Frank went through his normal routine, hanging his coat, checking his mail, turning on the radio for the evening news broadcast. He prepared a simple dinner of meatloaf and boiled potatoes, the kind of plain American meal that suited his cover identity. After eating, he tuned his radio to Mal and placed it near the bathroom window, the signal to his watchers that he needed an emergency meeting. Then he washed his dishes, read the evening paper, and prepared for bed, all while feeling the weight of the classified information he carried. The next morning, Frank followed his usual route to work but made a small deviation, stopping at Martin's newsstand on Pennsylvania Avenue. He purchased the Washington Post and a pack of Wrigley's gum. As he waited for his change, a woman in a red coat bumped against him. "Excuse me," she murmured, slipping a folded scrap of paper into his palm. Frank pocketed the paper without looking at it and continued his walk to the State Department. It wasn't until he was alone in a bathroom stall that he unfolded the note. National Gallery, American Impressionists, 12:30. At lunch, Frank told his secretary he was meeting an old college friend and walked the few blocks to the National Gallery of Art. The museum was busy with tourists and schoolchildren. He made his way to the American Impressionists room, where he spent several minutes studying Child Hassam's Allies' Day, May 1917, a patriotic scene of Fifth Avenue decorated with American, British, and French flags. "Beautiful brushwork," said a voice beside him. It belonged to a man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Mikhail, his handler for the past 3 years. "I've always admired the use of color," Frank responded, completing the recognition phrase. They moved to a bench in the center of the room where they could speak quietly while appearing to admire the artwork. "You've signaled an emergency," Mikhail said, his American accent flawless. "What's happened?" "Missiles in Cuba," Frank whispered. "Medium-range ballistics. The Americans have photographs. Kennedy has been briefed." Mikhail's expression remained neutral, but Frank noticed a tightening around his eyes. "Continue." Frank relayed the details from yesterday's meeting, the surveillance findings, the range capabilities of the missiles, the proposed American responses being considered. Mikhail listened without interruption, occasionally shifting position to maintain the appearance of two museum-goers in casual conversation. When Frank finished, Mikhail was silent for a moment. Then, "You've done well. This is valuable. Continue monitoring and report any developments through normal channels unless absolutely urgent." "There's something else," Frank said, lowering his voice further. "Why wasn't I informed about the missiles? This caught me completely off guard in the meeting." Mikhail's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not all information flows in all directions, my friend. You know this. It compromises my position if I'm surprised by major developments. I could have reacted inappropriately." "Your concerns are noted," Mikhail said, ending the discussion. "We should leave separately. You first." Frank stood, taking a final look at the Hassam painting before walking away. The flags of America's allies fluttered in frozen brushstrokes, a reminder of the alliances and enmities that shaped the world, and his double life within it. The next 2 weeks of the Cuban Missile Crisis were the most dangerous of Frank's career. He attended emergency meetings, prepared briefing materials, and monitored diplomatic communications, all while passing critical intelligence to Moscow through a series of brush passes and dead drops. The world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, with Frank straddling the divide, influencing both sides without either fully trusting him. When Khrushchev finally agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for American commitments, Frank felt a complex mixture of relief and unease. The immediate danger had passed, but questions lingered. Why had he been kept in the dark about the missiles? Was Moscow beginning to compartmentalize information from him? Or worse, did they suspect his loyalty was becoming compromised? These questions haunted Frank as winter descended on Washington. His apartment felt colder somehow, his isolation more acute. On Christmas Eve, he declined invitations from colleagues and sat alone listening to the Voice of America broadcast, then switched to Radio Moscow for comparison. The contradictory narratives of the same world events, each presented as absolute truth, mirrored his divided existence. In February 1963, the routine changed. A planned dead drop at Rock Creek Park was aborted when Frank spotted unfamiliar men who moved with the distinctive alertness of surveillance professionals. He walked past his drop site and continued his nature walk without leaving his package of film. That evening, he received a phone call from a wrong number asking for Uncle David. A warning signal that something had changed. 3 days later, Frank was working late when FBI Special Agent Thomas Reynolds appeared at his office door. "Mr. Keller, do you have a moment? I'd like to discuss some security concerns." Frank felt his mouth go dry but maintained his composure. "Of course, Agent Reynolds. Please, come in." Reynolds, a square-jawed man with the build of a former college athlete, sat across from Frank's desk and placed a manila folder between them. "We're conducting a routine security review of personnel with access to certain classified materials," Reynolds explained. "Just a few questions to help us tighten up procedures." What followed was a 40-minute interview that seemed casual but was precisely targeted. Reynolds asked about Frank's work routines, his access to specific documents, his interactions with Soviet diplomats at official functions. Each question probed for inconsistencies or vulnerabilities. "And your family background? Your parents were Austrian, correct?" Reynolds asked, glancing at his notes. "Yes," Frank replied. "The lie practiced for years. They passed away while I was at Columbia. No siblings." Reynolds nodded sympathetically. "Difficult to lose them so young. Did you ever visit Austria after coming to America?" "Once briefly, to settle their affairs." The questions continued, each seemingly innocent but building a web around him. When Reynolds finally left, Frank sat motionless, staring at the wall. His training had prepared him for this moment, but the reality was more terrifying than any simulation. The FBI was investigating him, perhaps not with specific suspicions yet, but they were looking more closely. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, checking and rechecking the security of his hidden communications equipment. His mind raced through scenarios: defect to Mexico and then Cuba, deny everything if confronted directly, offer to become a double agent. By morning, he'd made his decision. He would continue his work but prepare for exfiltration if necessary. He created a small escape package, cash, a backup identity document, a bus ticket to New York purchased under a different name, and hid it in a hollowed-out copy of The Great Gatsby on his bookshelf. For the next month, Frank worked under constant strain, feeling eyes on him that might or might not have been real. He maintained his normal routines while watching for signs of FBI surveillance. His dead drops became less frequent, his communications more cautious. The psychological pressure was immense. Each morning he wondered if this would be the day his office would be empty, his desk searched, his true identity exposed. In April, a new secretary joined the Soviet Affairs section. Fiona Wells was 32. With auburn hair and intelligent eyes behind fashionable glasses. She was efficient, pleasant, and asked thoughtful questions about the department's procedures. Too thoughtful, Frank realized after their third conversation. Her knowledge of Soviet economic structures was surprisingly detailed for an administrative position. One afternoon, she brought him coffee without being asked. "I noticed you missed lunch," she said, placing the cup on his desk. "The cafeteria had those molasses cookies you mentioned liking." Frank hadn't mentioned liking molasses cookies to anyone at State. "Thank you, Miss Wells," he replied, studying her face. "That was thoughtful." She held his gaze a moment too long before returning to her desk. That evening, Frank took an indirect route home, using counter-surveillance techniques to confirm his suspicion. Fiona Wells was following him. The FBI had placed her in his section to watch him. The next day, he tested her by leaving a classified memo visible on his desk when called to a meeting. When he returned, the document had been moved slightly, almost imperceptibly. But Frank had aligned it precisely with the edge of his blotter and knew it had been examined. For 2 weeks, he and Fiona performed an elaborate dance of hunter and hunted, each aware of the other's true purpose, but maintaining their professional facades. Frank considered his options and found them narrowing by the day. His KGB handler had gone silent. No acknowledgement of his last dead drop, no new instructions. The silence from Moscow was perhaps the most ominous sign of all. On May 2, 1963, Frank arrived at work to find Assistant Secretary Townsend waiting at his office. "Frank, the director wants to see you immediately," Townsend said, his expression grave. "May I ask what this is regarding?" Frank kept his voice steady. "Security matter. That's all I know." They walked in silence to the executive elevator. Frank's mind calculated escape routes, responses, scenarios, but he maintained his outward calm. In the director's antechamber, he noted 2 men in suits who didn't introduce themselves but watched him with careful attention. The director's office was imposing. American flags, heavy wooden furniture, the seal of the Department of State on the wall. Director Lambert sat behind his desk, with Agent Reynolds standing to his right. A tape recorder sat on the desk between them. "Please sit down, Mr. Keller," Lambert said, gesturing to the chair facing his desk. Frank sat, crossing his legs casually, settling his hands in his lap to hide any trembling. "Or should I say, Comrade Konyev?" Lambert added. The moment had arrived. Frank had rehearsed this scene in his mind countless times, but now that it was happening, he felt strangely detached, as though watching himself from across the room. "I'm not sure I understand, sir," he said, his voice betraying no emotion. Reynolds stepped forward and opened a folder. Friedrich Konyev, born in Moscow 1924, relocated to Vienna 1945, recruited by KGB Directorate S in 1949, infiltrated into the United States via Canada in 1950, naturalized as Frank Keller in 1952 through forged documentation. Frank maintained his confused expression. "There must be some mistake." Lambert leaned forward. "We have your KGB handler, Mr. Keller. Mikhail Popov was arrested 3 weeks ago. He's been quite cooperative." This explained the silence from Moscow. Frank's mind raced. If they had Mikhail, they likely had documentation, recognition phrases, dead drop locations. Denial was futile. "I'd like to speak with a lawyer," Frank said finally. "That can be arranged," Reynolds replied. "But first, we'd like to offer you an alternative." Lambert slid a document across the desk. "The FBI and CIA believe you could be valuable to us, Frank. You've been inside Soviet intelligence operations for years. You know procedures, personnel, communications methods." Frank stared at the document, a cooperation agreement. "You want me to become a double agent. We want you to serve the country that has been your home for over a decade," Lambert said. "The country that gave you opportunities Moscow never could. And if I refuse? Espionage charges. 20 years minimum at Leavenworth, possibly execution." Frank looked at the document, then at the men watching him. "May I have some time to consider?" 24 hours, Reynolds said. "You'll be under surveillance. Any attempt to contact Soviet assets or leave the district will result in immediate arrest." Frank was escorted from the building, not in handcuffs, but with 2 FBI agents who drove him home and established a surveillance post outside his apartment. They made no effort to hide their presence. Moscow would already know he'd been compromised. Alone in his apartment, Frank poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in darkness. The decision before him was impossible. Betray Moscow and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for KGB assassins, or refuse and spend decades in an American prison. Either way, his life as he knew it was over. He thought of his parents, now long dead. The KGB photographs that had first pressured him into service had been his last glimpse of them. Had his years of service protected them as promised? Or had they been merely pawns in his recruitment, discarded once he was operational? He thought of his colleagues at State, the men and women who had accepted him as one of their own. Some were friends, or as close to friends as his compartmentalized life would allow. Had any of them suspected? Had Townsend or Lambert harbored doubts all these years? And he thought of America, the country he had been trained to undermine but had come to understand intimately. Its contradictions and hypocrisies existed alongside genuine idealism and opportunity. The Soviet system he served had its own parallel contradictions, its own mix of noble aims and brutal methods. At dawn, Frank made his decision. He showered, shaved, and dressed in his best suit. He packed a small suitcase with essential items, then removed his escape package from The Great Gatsby. He left most of his possessions untouched, the furniture, books, and clothes that had formed the backdrop of Frank Keller's fictional life. When he opened his front door, the FBI agents were waiting. "I'm ready," he told them. At FBI headquarters, Frank signed the cooperation agreement. For the next 6 hours, he was debriefed on basic KGB protocols and communication systems. It was only the beginning of what would be months of intensive interviews, revealing the architecture of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. What Frank couldn't tell them, was that he had made a private calculation during that night of reflection. He would appear to cooperate fully while withholding certain critical information. He would feed the Americans enough valuable intelligence to maintain his credibility while protecting specific Soviet assets he considered important. He would play a triple game, officially America's asset, secretly still loyal to Moscow in specific ways, but ultimately serving only his own survival. In the months that followed, Frank lived in a safe house in Virginia, working with CIA and FBI debriefers daily. He was given a new identity in preparation for eventual relocation under the nascent Witness Protection Program. The information he provided led to the identification of 3 other Soviet agents within the U.S. government. In November 1963, he watched the coverage of Kennedy's assassination from his safe house, wondering if there were layers to the tragedy that even he wasn't privy to. When the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald had acted alone, Frank recognized the narrative construction, the same way intelligence agencies on both sides created simple explanations for complex events. By 1964, Frank's active debriefings had slowed. The Americans had extracted what they considered the most valuable intelligence from him. He was relocated to Denver, Colorado, with a new identity as Frederick Kane, a business consultant. He was given a modest home, a government pension disguised as investment income, and a cover story about a career in international trade. Frank, now Frederick, lived quietly, teaching occasional Russian language classes at the local university. Twice a year, FBI agents would visit to check on him and ask follow-up questions about Soviet operations. He maintained his performance of the grateful defector, the reformed communist who had embraced American values. In 1968, during one such visit, he was shown photographs of a car accident in Vienna. "Do you recognize this man?" the FBI agent asked. The photograph showed the body of Mikhail Popov, his former handler, thrown from a vehicle on a mountain road. "Yes," Frank replied. "What happened?" "KGB. They don't forgive traitors." The warning was clear. Moscow still eliminated those who betrayed them, even years later. Frank was only safe as long as he remained under American protection. The decades passed. Frank watched the ebb and flow of Cold War tensions from a unique perspective. a man who had served both sides and betrayed both in turn. He followed the news of détente in the 70s, renewed tensions under Reagan in the 80s, and the astonishing collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. When the Berlin Wall fell, he opened an expensive bottle of vodka he had been saving and drank alone in his living room, toasting the end of an era, his era. With the Soviet Union gone, both his service and his betrayal became historical footnotes rather than active concerns. In 1994, now 70 years old, Frank received an unexpected letter forwarded through his FBI contacts. It contained only a photograph of a grave in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery with his parents' names and a single line in Russian. They died with honor in 1954. The revelation was devastating. His parents had been dead for 40 years, long before many of his most valuable intelligence contributions to the KGB. The continued threats against their well-being had been a fiction designed to maintain his loyalty. Moscow had lied to him just as he had lied for Moscow. In 2001, as a new century brought new enemies and new forms of warfare, Frank watched the Twin Towers fall on his television and recognized that his world of ideological espionage had been replaced by something different. The clarity of the Cold War, however morally ambiguous its methods, seemed almost quaint compared to the chaotic threats of the modern era. In 2005, at age 81, Frank was diagnosed with lung cancer. The FBI arranged for his medical care, still protecting their asset even as his value diminished with time. During his hospital stays, he began writing his memoirs, not for publication, but as a personal reckoning with the life he had lived. On a cold morning in January 2006, Frank finished the final page of his manuscript. He sealed it in an envelope addressed to the CIA's Historical Review Division, with instructions that it remain classified until 2030. That afternoon, he sat in a wheelchair by the window of his Denver home, watching snow fall on the Front Range Mountains. His nurse had stepped out to pick up his prescriptions. Frank poured himself a final glass of vodka, against doctor's orders, and raised it in a toast. "To the game," he whispered in Russian, then English. "To both sides of the looking glass." He drank, feeling the familiar burn down his throat, and closed his eyes. Friedrich Konev and Frank Keller, two names for a man who had never fully belonged to either world he inhabited, a shadow passing between superpowers, leaving behind only questions about where true loyalty resides when one lives a life divided against itself. 3 weeks later, he died quietly in his sleep. The local newspaper ran a small obituary for Frederick Kane, noting only his teaching career and his contributions to the local Russian Cultural Society. No mention was made of his service to two nations or his betrayal of both. History would render its own verdict on the man who had lived and died between worlds. In a secure facility in Langley, Virginia, his manuscript was filed away, one more artifact from a conflict that had shaped a century, the testament of a mole who had burrowed so deep that, in the end, even he could not say with certainty which side he had truly served.